Hello, thank you for joining with me. We are reading with the Course Companions, and this is Cameo 29. Iambic, I always mispronounce this, pentameter. Iambic pentameter. And this is Robert Perry's essay, Cameo 29. Reading out of A Course in Miracles, complete and annotated edition, edited by Robert Perry, and we are reading with the Course Companions reading group. The section, The Christ in You, in chapter 24 of the text, can be regarded as the beginning of consistent iambic pentameter in the text. From here it is more or less continuous for the rest of the text. It then picks up in the workbook in lesson 98, after which it runs unbroken to the end of the workbook. In the manual, it is used only in selected passages of special importance. Iambic pentameter is a fundamental building block of English poetry. It is most predominantly associated with William Shakespeare, who wrote both plays and poetry in it, but it has been a standard literary convention from before Shakespeare up to the present day. To understand iambic pentameter, you only have to understand two things. First is the basic unit is a two-syllable foot, which in this case consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, such as the word before. Second, a line of iambic pentameter consists of 5 such feet. As a result, a line will sound like a series of 5 heartbeats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. We can hear these 5 heartbeats in a famous line from Shakespeare. If music be the food of love, play on. A writer need not be a slave to this exact structure, however. Poets will often skillfully diverge from strict iambic pentameter, as Shakespeare himself did. Discovering where the iambic pentameter starts in the course can be tricky, since anything written in English will naturally have occasional lines fall into iambic pentameter. However, in the early sections of chapter 24, one can see passages that seem quite intentionally to employ this form. For example, in the final paragraph of section 2, we find these sentences, which fit the form perfectly. They ask of you but that your will be done. They seek your love that you may love yourself. Love not your specialness instead of them. The print of nails is on your hands as well. The frequency of such examples increases until the final 4 paragraphs of section 4 are mostly in iambic pentameter. Finally, section 5, The Christ in You, is an unusually poetic section with concrete imagery that is both moving. He sings to them of heaven that their ears may hear no more sounds of battle and of death, and at times jarring. For example, there is the graphic image of a rotting corpse, with flesh already loosened from the bone. It is in this poetic section that the text begins its continuous use of poetic verse. At this early stage, the iambic pentameter is quite rough, with around a quarter of the lines not fitting the strict form. However, it gets smoother and smoother until by the time we reach 27 it is nearly perfect, and remains so for the rest of the text. Helen loved Shakespeare as well as other great English poets. As a young person, she even had dreams of being a great poet. The question naturally arises then, was Helen herself the source of the iambic pentameter? Was she somehow taking the ideas that Jesus passed on to her and rendering them in words that fit the iambic pentameter? Or was the material instead being received by her in a form that already fit the meter? I have doubts about that, because otherwise it would have been perfect from the beginning. It wouldn't have improved. That's just my thought. Okay. We can safely say it was the latter. For one, it seems clear that in the very earliest sections of the iambic pentameter, Helen did not notice it was there. We say that because she often made little changes in wording that actually broke the meter. Here are two such changes just from the Christ in You, with each line being a line of iambic pentameter and the words in brackets representing the new wording that she read into the Your text. And we'll go down to footnote 1. The first example in was inserted, and the second example within yourself replaced in you. So, that you have not, he is your eyes, your ears. And then she put in, he is in your eyes, your ears. Second sentence, you thought you saw in you his holiness. And then she added, you thought you saw in you within yourself his holiness. In both cases, the original line fit the meter, whilst the changed version did not. Later on, Helen valued the iambic pentameter so much that she would closely monitor any lack of fit so she could correct it. It is therefore hard to imagine that she would knowingly do the exact opposite here. Take lines that fit the meter and correct them so that they no longer fit it. We can safely conclude then that when the iambic pentameter first started coming through, Helen didn't notice its presence. Ken Wapnick reported the same thing, saying the iambic pentameter was unknown to Helen at first. But after a while she realized the words were coming in a definite rhythm. However, by one chapter later, chapter 25, section 4, Helen had clearly noticed the iambic pentameter. We can see this on the pages of her notebooks where she marked the divisions between the iambic pentameter lines with double quotation marks. And here is an example from text chapter 25, section 7. And it's hard to read her writing, but until he comes to something, I don't know, it cost him sanity, it stands between him. I don't know, I can't read her writing. So check this out on the screen. Notice the double quotation marks after comes in the first line, sanity in the second line, and hope in the third line. This was Helen's way at this point of marking the line divisions in the iambic pentameter. And I forgot to read footnote 2, Kenneth Wapnick, The History of the Manuscripts of A Course in Miracles. And then there's a web address if you want to check it out. Just pause the video and write it down. Okay. This raises a question that is similar to the early one. Just as we asked whether the iambic pentameter came from Helen or Jesus, we now need to ask if Helen figured out where the line breaks fell or if she received those line breaks from Jesus. The most natural explanation would seem to be the first, for it would not have been difficult for Helen to simply count off the 5 feet and then insert her little quotation mark. This would have been especially easy to do after the fact, to go back in, count out the syllables, and note the line divisions. There are, however, serious problems with the idea that Helen herself decided where the line breaks should go. The first one is that at this stage in the iambic pentameter, as we note above, it is quite rough, with about a quarter of the lines not fitting the meter. The effect of this is that there are a number of different ways to break the lines in a given paragraph. For example, let's look at one of the paragraphs in question. This is the final paragraph of chapter 25, the notes version of chapter 25, section 10:9. The miracle that you receive you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law on which salvation rests. That justice must be done to all if anyone is to be healed. No one can lose and everyone must benefit. Each miracle is an example of what justice can accomplish when it is offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is awareness that giving and receiving are the same, because it does not make the same unlike. It sees no differences where none exist. and thus it is the same for everyone, because it sees no differences in them. Its offering is universal, and it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is his due. There are many ways to divide the lines of iambic pentameter in this paragraph. The first sentence is easy. It fits the meter perfectly. But not long after that we get into trouble. What follows is one way to break the lines in this paragraph with those that do not fit the meter rendered in boldface. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of, and now we're going into bold, the law on which salvation rests, that justice must, now we're getting out of bold, to be done to all if anyone is to be healed. No one can lose and everyone must benefit. Each miracle is an, now we're going into bold, example of what justice can accomplish. When it is offered to everyone alike, it is received and given equally. It is awareness that giving and now we're going into on bold, receiving are the same because it does, back to bold, not make the same unlike, it sees no differences. On bold, where none exist, and thus it is the same, bold, for everyone, because it sees no differences in them. Its offering is universal, and now on bold, it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is his due. This is not a very satisfying arrangement, since 8 of the lines do not fit the meter. So we tried 3 other arrangements. One had 10 lines that did not fit, one had 8, and the final one we got down to was 5. The latter arrangement, however, was not preferable because one of its lines contained stresses that were badly off, which is worse than the number of syllables being off. As you can imagine, it can take a lot of time to try out these different arrangements and compare them to one another to see which is best. Yet perhaps this is exactly what Helen was doing, going off, trying different arrangements, selecting the best, and then going back in and inserting quotation marks. We can, however, say with confidence that this was not happening. Helen was inserting the line breaks as she took dictation. We say this for a simple reason. The gaps between the words are longer when her double quotation marks are present. You can see this in the sample we included above. If you cover up the quotation marks with your finger, you can see that where the quotation marks are present, there is a larger than normal gap between the words. We have tested this visual impression, having carefully measured more than 400 gaps between words. In paragraph after paragraph, we find a consistent result. The gaps between words that include Helen's quotation marks are more than 50% longer than the normal gaps. The only explanation for such a consistent result is that she was writing those marks while taking the dictation. How else could those marks have taken up extra space, moving over the words that followed them? And this can only mean one thing. Jesus was somehow communicating to Helen where the line divisions should go. While the iambic pentameter is rough, there is simply no way to know where the line breaks should go without having the entire paragraph in front of you and seeing the effect of your decisions on the lines that follow. In other words, to do it optimally, you have to know what is coming later in the paragraph. To demonstrate this, let's look at how Jesus, for we can safely say it was Jesus, divided the lines in that sample paragraph we looked at earlier. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law on which salvation rests, that justice must be done to all if anyone is to be healed. And the miracle was bolded in that. Now this is bolded. No one can lose and everyone must benefit. Now unbolded. Each miracle is an example of what justice can accomplish when it is, unbold, now we're going back to bold, offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is awareness. Unbold. That giving and receiving are the same because it does not make the same unlike. It sees no differences where none exist. And we're going to go down to footnote 3. Note, we counted this line and the 1-2 lines further down as fitting the meter, on the assumption that the word differences is pronounced as 3 syllables, which is one of the correct ways of pronouncing it. Differences. And thus, it is the same for everyone because it sees no differences in them. Its offering is universal, and it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is His due. So this was looking at how Jesus divided the lines in that sample paragraph. Okay? Notice how much more elegant Jesus' solution to the iambic pentameter is in this paragraph, with only 4 lines that do not fit the meter. See the lines in bold, so the bolded did not fit the meter. Notice also that he accomplishes this by sacrificing lines that on their own could fit the meter perfectly, but once sacrificed will make what follows fit better. His first sacrifice is in the very first sentence, which is a sentence of perfect iambic pentameter. It may not occur to someone to break up that sentence. Why do so? But it turns out that making this seemingly unnecessary sacrifice at the beginning is the key to make the rest of the paragraph work best. And I'm going to read that. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law on which salvation rests, that justice must be done to all if anyone is to be healed. Of course, that's the first paragraph. All right, so also the 3rd and 4th lines that don't fit could have fit without a hitch. Offer to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is. Yet they too are sacrificed for what is coming. By sacrificing them, he avoids the line mentioned earlier, in which the stresses are jarringly off. Awareness, that giving and receiving. We have spent a good deal of time on this fairly technical discussion because it actually affords one of our best windows into the mechanics of the dictation. First, we established that Jesus dictated large portions of the course to Helen in iambic pentameter, requiring him to control both the number of syllables and the stresses in those syllables. He did this even before she was aware of him doing so. When then established that Jesus somehow communicated to Helen where the line break should go. We then established that Jesus somehow communicated to Helen where the line break should go. Finally, we observed that he could only have done this based on a verbatim knowledge of what was coming later in the paragraph. This last point is particularly significant. In the early chapters of the dictation process, one has the impression that Jesus is speaking to Helen extemporaneously, as any normal speaker would, since he and she often go back and forth in brief dialogues. As normal speakers, we have only a vague idea of what we are going to say next, with perhaps an occasional phrase that is pre-planned. We only know all of the exact words we will say when we are reading a prepared speech. In these later chapters, Jesus seems to be doing something very much like that. It is as if he is reading from a finished document. He appears to know with perfect accuracy the exact words he is going to dictate to Helen in the coming sentences. He seems to have the entire paragraph before him, complete in every word and complete with line divisions for the iambic pentameter. This would actually explain one of Helen's main observations about the dictation process. And this is Helen. The writing was highly interruptible. At the office, I could lay the notebook down to answer the telephone, talk to a patient, supervise a junior staff member, or attend one of our numerous emergencies, and return to the writing without even checking back to see where I left off. At home, I could talk to my husband, chat with a friend, or take a nap, going back to the notebook afterwards, without disturbing the flow of words in the slightest. It did not matter whether I had stopped at the end of a paragraph or in the middle of a sentence. It was as if the voice merely waited until I came back and then started in again. Footnote 4, and that's from her autobiography, page 42. Bill described the highly interruptible nature of the scribing by saying the material was there almost as if it had been pre-recorded and was waiting for her attention. Footnote 5. That was a New Realities interview with Bill and Thetford, retrieved from ACIM archives. Okay. All of this sounds very much like what we have just concluded. It is as if Jesus was dictating from an already composed original. This is a particularly surprising finding given our experience of how normal speaking works. No one, except perhaps an autistic savant, carries around word-for-word speeches in his or her head and then recites them from memory. Yet that appears to be what Jesus did with Helen, at least in these later chapters. On the other hand, perhaps this explanation inappropriately assumes that Jesus is within linear time. The Course's teaching claims that he is outside of linear time, and what we may be seeing here is actual evidence that this is true, that he was speaking to Helen from a place outside of time, in which there was an all-at-onceness to the process. A paragraph, in other words, was perhaps composed all at once rather than through a linear process. And then, from that place of simultaneity, he merely fed the material to Helen one word at a time. Perhaps then what we are observing here is a tiny concrete clue as to the timelessness of the place from which the Course originated. Whatever the explanation, it is clear that Jesus put an immense amount of precise planning into the iambic pentameter. He clearly wanted the Course to not just be a series of abstract ideas, but also to be poetry. And the reason for this is not particularly mysterious. After all, the emotional impact of poetry allows our minds and hearts to be unexpectedly humble into new places, places that would otherwise remain closed to us. In short, poetry moves us, and that is precisely Jesus' goal in the Course, to move our hearts and minds into fundamentally new territory. Now we will read Robert Perry's commentary on this Cameo 29, Iambic Pentameter. This is another cameo I am very fond of. The iambic pentameter, I feel, affords us a little window into Jesus' side of the communication. With the Course, as with any channeling, the natural question is whether this information really is coming from an independent entity or whether it is simply coming from the channel herself, either consciously or unconsciously. I think we have good reason to believe that Helen didn't consciously compose the Course, but how do we know that it didn't just spill out of her unconscious? How do we know there was an actual independent mind just as alive and conscious as her own that was communicating with her? One of the benefits of the iambic pentameter is that it shows a great deal of careful, structured composition that did not come from Helen consciously, and that is very hard to see as coming from her unconsciously. We see Jesus speaking in iambic pentameter, a very precise form of meter, before Helen realized that he was doing so. We see him eventually indicating the line breaks to her. And we see him apparently having paragraphs planned out in advance, complete with carefully thought through line breaks. Can you imagine Helen's unconscious doing all of that? I can't. It naturally implies an independent consciousness with its own intentions and creativity. If we are dealing with a mind that is genuinely independent of Helen's, that raises another issue. Is this mind actually beyond the human as it clearly claims? The iambic pentameter can't resolve that question for us, but I do feel there is a hint in there. Think about the author having the iambic pentameter paragraphs fully formed, complete with those creative line breaks. What human speaker does that? Imagine meeting someone who spoke to you seemingly extemporaneously, but then when you played back his words, you discovered the situation we see in this cameo. You discovered that what he said was an iambic pentameter, that he somehow indicated the line breaks to you, and that because they were creatively chosen in the manner we see in the cameo, you can tell that everything he said was carefully planned out in advance. Wouldn't you start to think this guy is not human? Once I discovered this situation in the course, and then noticed the resemblance with statements Helen and Bill made, like Bill's comment that it was almost as if it had been pre-recorded, I got an interesting and unexpected impression, which had never occurred to me before. I got a sense that perhaps the course, in the place it was coming from, wasn't being composed over time as Helen received it, but existed all at once, already complete, in a timeless state, and that Helen just experienced it as unfolding in a linear process. I realize that such a scenario is not demanded by the evidence we see here, but it felt consistent with that evidence, perhaps even suggested by it. Interestingly, a couple years after having these thoughts, I was reading some channeled material someone sent me, called the Joseph Communications, and the source of that material was saying the exact same thing. He said the book is already in existence in my mind, and that, from his vantage point, present and future channeling sessions were all taking place at the same time. And that's Your Life After Death by Michael Riccia, page 163. He said, it's very difficult, you see, to become linear with you. For me, the book is already here, and I'm drawing on certain aspects of it that I hope to present to you in a time frame that makes sense to you. Interesting, isn't it? There are many, many things that have pushed me to the conclusion that the author of the Course is beyond human, that we are dealing with the divine mind here. But the iambic pentameter situation is a concrete and enchanting gem in this regard. It feels to me like a little window onto what was happening on the author's side of the interaction, a tiny window into a whole different realm. I'm reminded of that device in certain stores where someone has a dream that is incredibly vivid and lifelike, and then when she wakes up and assumes that it was just a dream, she finds an actual object from the dream in her hand, let's say a ring, proving that the world she visited was real. That's how the iambic pentameter situation feels to me. It's the ring we hold in our hands, for here is something concrete and physical. We can see Helen's quotation marks where the line breaks are. We can show by measurement that they were put in as she wrote, not afterwards. That is the tangible evidence of the other world she contacted. And if that other world was really there, if that mind she contacted was real and was divine, then what does that say about what he came to tell us? Thank you so much for joining with me. Thank you for the Course Companions group. Thank you, Robert Perry, Emily Bennington. This is day 284, Cameo 29, Iambic Pentameter. Of course, I've had to say that 100 times and I still say it wrong. I love you. Thank you.